It was a moment that no one expected. Jill Biden, standing at the podium with her confident smile, leaned into the microphone and addressed the audience with a challenge. "Senator Kennedy, I have to say your speeches are always impressive. But I bet when it comes to an IQ test, you might not fare as well as you think. How about it? A little test to see who's really got the brains?" The room fell silent for a second. Her words were light, playful even, but there was an undercurrent of mockery that no one missed. The audience tensed, unsure if Jill was truly serious or just making a joke. Kennedy, the calm and collected senator, stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. He could have laughed it off. He could have made a witty retort, just like he always did in his speeches. But instead, he stood there looking at Jill with an intensity that sent a shiver through the room. His gaze never wavered as he slowly walked up to the stage, the crowd now completely silent in anticipation. Jill's eyes sparkled with amusement, as if she had already won this round. "Well, Senator Kennedy, I guess we'll see how smart you really are, won't we?" Kennedy reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a letter sealed with an old wax stamp. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he quietly placed the letter on the podium and opened it with a slow, deliberate motion. The tension in the room grew thicker. Jill raised an eyebrow, sensing something was coming. Her confident smile faltered slightly. Kennedy wasn't playing by her rules. The letter wasn't just any letter. It was personal, something only he understood. And with each second that passed, the audience could feel it, the shift from mockery to something far more dangerous. Seconds. That's all it took. The audience leaned in as Kennedy finally spoke. "This letter," he said, his voice calm, "is more important than any IQ test, and it holds the answer that will crush the challenge you've just thrown at me." The room held its breath. As Kennedy placed the letter on the podium, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The words on the paper weren't about intellectual prowess or political debates. They were about something deeper, something that had shaped him into the man he was today. A man who had always been underestimated, but who had learned to use that very underestimation to his advantage. Born in the small town of Zachary, Louisiana, John Neely Kennedy had never been the genius his peers expected him to be. His childhood was marked by the same cruel teasing that so many experience, being the slow kid in class, the one who couldn't keep up with his peers. He had always struggled with tests, with books, with those who claimed that intelligence was about numbers and letters on a page. But it wasn't just the world around him that doubted him. He had doubted himself too. His parents, while loving and supportive, weren't rich. They didn't have the means to give him the best education or extra tutoring. They only had their words, their stories, and their strength. It was in these moments, sitting at the dinner table or in the small, creaky porch swing of their house, that Kennedy found his true education. His mother, a woman of quiet wisdom, taught him one of the most valuable lessons he would ever learn. True intelligence isn't in what you know, it's in how you use what you know to shape the world around you. But it was his mentor, Miss Clara, who had given him the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Clara had been his music teacher during the long summer days when he felt like an outsider. Her house was filled with old banjos, fiddles, and the sweet, sorrowful sounds of Cajun music. She had seen the quiet, awkward kid who sat in the corner of the room, too shy to speak up, and had recognized the spark of something greater within him. "You see, John," Miss Clara had said, handing him a banjo for the first time, "people will judge you by how you look, by what they think you know. But they can't measure your heart. And when you play from your heart, that's when you show them who you really are." It wasn't long before Kennedy was playing music, not to prove a point to anyone, but because it was the first thing that truly felt like him. Music became his voice, his outlet for the thoughts he couldn't express in words, and his way of understanding the world. He never forgot Miss Clara's words. They shaped his political journey, his speeches, and most importantly, his decision to accept this challenge today. Now, standing in front of Jill Biden, he wasn't just a senator. He was a man who had been through the grind of life, of failure, of ridicule. And yet it was that very ridicule that had forged him into the person who stood before her now. The letter he had opened on the podium wasn't a symbol of intellect or academia. It was a letter from Miss Clara, one he had kept for years. A letter that reminded him of the true meaning of courage. As Jill continued to stand there, her smug expression slowly fading, Kennedy felt the power of those past lessons flowing through him. He wasn't just being challenged. He was being given the opportunity to show the world that intelligence wasn't about fitting into a mold. It was about resilience, heart, and the ability to face the storm and stand tall no matter what others thought of you. Jill had underestimated him. And now, with each passing second, she would see just how wrong she was. The day after the public challenge, the world was watching. Kennedy could feel the eyes of the nation upon him, as the debate on his intelligence became the topic of conversation in every political circle and coffee shop. Jill Biden had done her job. She had publicly challenged him, throwing a gauntlet that had shaken his composure. He had always been seen as the calm, collected politician, but now, in the eyes of the public, that image was starting to crack. Social media buzzed with hashtags like John Kennedy IQ Challenge and Don Jill vs. Kennedy, while talk show hosts joked about the academic showdown. For once, Kennedy wasn't just a politician in a suit, he was a punchline. And yet he didn't flinch. He didn't engage in the online bickering. Instead, he sat at his desk looking at the letter Miss Clara had given him, as if it were a shield. But behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. His team tried to reassure him. "Senator, just ignore the noise. Don't let this distract you," they would say. But it wasn't just the media chatter that kept Kennedy up at night. It was the nagging fear that Jill's challenge wasn't about proving intelligence. It was about something deeper. It was about diminishing him. She wasn't just calling his intelligence into question. She was questioning his worth, his legacy, and everything he had fought for in his life. The press conference the following morning was filled with reporters eager to get a reaction from Kennedy. As cameras flashed, Jill Biden stood next to him with an innocent smile, pretending to be unaffected by the storm she had started. "Senator Kennedy," a reporter shouted, "do you accept the challenge to take the IQ test and prove your intellect?" Kennedy's hand tightened around the podium. The question hung in the air almost like a dare. He had been silent on the matter for days, allowing the buzz to grow louder and louder. Now it was time to respond. "Let's get one thing clear." Kennedy's voice was calm but carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "Intelligence is not something you can measure on a scale. It's about resilience, the ability to learn from life and the courage to stand up when everyone expects you to fall." The room grew quiet as Kennedy's words sank in. But Jill, ever the professional, didn't let the silence last for long. "Of course, Senator, I agree. But let's not confuse intelligence with stubbornness or pride." She smiled, but there was a sharpness in her words, as if she were trying to push Kennedy into a corner. "You see, the world expects us to be more than just political figures. We're expected to be more than the sum of our speeches and charisma. I thought it would be interesting to see just how much more you are." Her words felt like a challenge, not just to Kennedy's intelligence, but to his very identity. It was a test of character, a test of how far he was willing to go to prove himself. Jill wasn't just poking fun at his intellect. She was making a statement, one that said she didn't believe in him. And that, more than anything, stung. Kennedy met her gaze with unwavering confidence. "I don't need a test to prove who I am, Jill," he said, his voice steady. "But I will accept your challenge. Because this isn't about showing you what I know. It's about showing you what I've become despite the odds." Jill's smile wavered for just a second before she regained her composure. Behind the scenes, Kennedy's team scrambled. The pressure was building, and everyone had their own opinions on how to handle it. His advisors suggested he turn the test into a media event, an opportunity to show that his intellect was just as sharp as his political savvy. But Kennedy refused to play into their hands. "I'm not a showman," he told his team. "I'm a man who's been underestimated my entire life. I'll take this test, but on my terms. This isn't a game." Meanwhile, Jill's team was doing everything they could to control the narrative. They were framing the challenge as a lighthearted yet important moment of clarity for Kennedy, a way for him to prove he wasn't just a politician, but a man of intellect. The media painted the challenge as a playful dare, but Jill knew exactly what she was doing. The tension between them was palpable now. What started as a simple political exchange had escalated into something much more personal. Jill was not only attacking Kennedy's mind, she was attacking his identity as a leader. The question on everyone's lips wasn't just whether he would take the test, but whether he would survive the public scrutiny. As Kennedy prepared for the test, there was a nagging doubt in his mind. Not about his intelligence, he knew that part, but about whether he could handle the emotional toll of being publicly humiliated. For the first time in his life, he felt like a puppet on a string, controlled by a game he hadn't asked to play. But as the day of the test loomed closer, one thing became clear. Kennedy wasn't about to back down. This was no longer about the test itself. It was about showing the world who he was, and the world was about to learn something they had long overlooked. The day of the IQ test arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. It wasn't just any test anymore. It had turned into a spectacle. Media outlets flooded the venue with cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and the public on the edge of their seats. The world was watching closely, waiting to see if Kennedy would rise to the occasion or falter in front of the entire country. Jill Biden arrived early, looking calm and collected, her trademark smile plastered on her face. She was confident, almost too confident. To her, this was just a game, a way to prove that intellect was the most important currency in the political world. And she thought she had Kennedy cornered. But what Jill didn't know was that Kennedy had a different plan. A plan that wasn't about proving his intellect, but about showing the world what he truly stood for. As the test began, Jill settled into her seat, watching Kennedy from across the room. He was quiet, focused, but there was something about his demeanor that made her uneasy. He wasn't rattled by the spotlight, by the pressure of the moment. If anything, he seemed detached, like the challenge didn't even matter to him. Kennedy didn't take out the test papers immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the same letter he had sealed earlier, the one that Miss Clara had given him all those years ago. As he held it in his hands, something in him shifted. The weight of that letter was a reminder of everything he had overcome, of every doubt he had faced. It wasn't about proving his intelligence to Jill or the world. It was about proving to himself that he had something far greater than a test score. The timer started. Kennedy took the test, but it was clear he wasn't in a rush to finish. Every question, every answer was a deliberate move, not driven by a need to impress, but by the understanding that true wisdom comes from experience, not just raw knowledge. Meanwhile, Jill watched him with growing frustration. He wasn't playing by her rules. She had expected him to flounder, to show signs of stress, but instead he was calm, collected, and unshaken. It made her uneasy, but she pushed that feeling aside. She had a plan, and she was convinced it would work. The room fell silent as the final moments of the test approached. Kennedy glanced at the clock and stood up, signaling that he was done. He walked over to the desk where the results were to be sealed and handed over to the moderators. Jill, eager to see his score, watched with bated breath. This was the moment. This was the validation she had been waiting for. But as Kennedy reached for the envelope, he did something no one expected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter from Miss Clara once again. He didn't say a word. He simply walked up to Jill slowly, calmly, and handed her the letter. Jill hesitated, unsure of what was happening. "What's this?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of confusion. "Read it," Kennedy said simply. She took the letter in her hands, still not fully understanding. As she read the words aloud, the room fell silent once again. The letter wasn't about IQ scores, academics, or test results. It was a personal message from Kennedy's mentor written years ago. "It's not the test that defines you," Miss Clara's letter read. "It's your ability to stand in the face of ridicule and rise above it. Intelligence is not in numbers or words, but in how you use your heart, your experience, and your courage to change the world. Remember, true intelligence is about knowing when to walk away from the things that seek to break you, and when to rise up against them." The letter was a public revelation of everything Kennedy had been through, everything he had learned, and the legacy of his real intelligence, the wisdom and strength forged through years of hardship and doubt. The room was silent. Jill stood frozen, staring at the letter in her hands. She had expected to hold the score that would define him, but instead, she was holding a letter that completely undermined her challenge. Kennedy's strength wasn't in his IQ score. It was in his ability to transform adversity into wisdom and compassion. Kennedy spoke again, his voice steady. But now there was a quiet power behind it. "I didn't need to take an IQ test to show you who I am, Jill. What I needed to show you is that intelligence doesn't come from numbers. It comes from what you do with the cards you're dealt." The room erupted. Jill stood there, her expression now completely blank. The public had expected an intellectual showdown, but what they got instead was a lesson in character, courage, and resilience. Jill had underestimated Kennedy in the worst way possible. She had thought this was about intellect. But he had shown her that true power lies in the strength of your character and the willingness to fight back when the world doubts you. Kennedy's challenge was never about proving anything to Jill. It was about proving to the world that real wisdom comes from the lessons we learn, the people we meet, and the strength we build along the way. The room was buzzing, filled with whispers, gasps, and murmurs. Jill Biden stood in stunned silence, holding the letter in her hands, completely unprepared for the turn of events. Kennedy, the man she had mocked, had just delivered a masterstroke, and she now found herself in the middle of a storm she hadn't seen coming. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The world had just witnessed a moment that would define him far beyond any IQ test, far beyond politics or the public stage. His calm, steady demeanor hadn't been a sign of weakness. It had been his greatest strength. While the world expected him to rise to the challenge of the test, he had risen above it. He had shown the world that intelligence wasn't something you could box into a test score. It was something you lived, something that showed in your actions and your choices. Jill's smile faltered, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to say. The media was silent, their cameras capturing the shift. Kennedy had not only turned the tables, he had rewritten the narrative. For Kennedy, this wasn't about winning in the conventional sense. It was about showing that there was a higher standard to live by. It was about proving that the things that truly mattered were honor, integrity, and humility. And in the moments that followed, the world began to understand that. Kennedy turned his gaze to Jill, who was still holding the letter, looking at it with an expression that had turned from confident mockery to a faint recognition of her own mistake. She had underestimated him, and in doing so, she had forced him to show the world the very essence of his character. "Jill," Kennedy said calmly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of understanding. "It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about doing what's right, standing for something greater than yourself and lifting others up along the way. I've lived that, and it's made me who I am. You've challenged my mind, but I hope you'll understand what I've really come here to show you." The room grew quieter, the weight of his words sinking in. Jill nodded slowly, unable to respond. She had expected to expose Kennedy's vulnerabilities, but in doing so, she had revealed her own. Meanwhile, the media outlets were alive with coverage. The headlines were already shifting. What had begun as a challenge to Kennedy's intellect had transformed into a profound lesson on character. The public didn't just want to know about Kennedy's IQ score anymore. They wanted to know about the man behind the public persona. They wanted to understand how someone could stand under such pressure and not break. Outside the room, the tension had reached its peak. People had gathered around, eagerly awaiting the moment when Kennedy would finally reveal his test score, only to realize that the score didn't matter. What mattered was that he had passed the test of character. Kennedy walked up to the microphone one final time. His calm eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of those who had doubted him. He spoke slowly, his voice low but full of conviction. "You see," he began, "this test, this challenge, it's not really about IQ. It's about the choices we make. It's about facing down ridicule, looking the world in the eye and knowing that you don't have to play by their rules. Intelligence? It's a word we throw around without truly understanding what it means. But I've lived long enough to know that the real test is not how much you know, but what you do with what you've learned." The crowd was silent, absorbing every word. Jill, standing behind him, felt the full weight of what she had started. Her challenge had been a mistake, but it had opened a door to something far greater. Kennedy wasn't the only one who had transformed that day. She had, too. Kennedy paused for a moment, letting the silence speak for itself. Before adding one final line, "I'll leave you all with this. Intelligence is not measured by tests, but by the heart. And that's what I've shown you today." With that, Kennedy turned and walked off the stage, his head held high, not because of a test score, but because of his own strength and resolve. He had proven that real intelligence wasn't confined to a number. It was about being true to yourself no matter what the world thought. The days following the public challenge were filled with a buzz that Kennedy hadn't anticipated. What started as a playful jab from Jill Biden had spiraled into something far more profound. The media coverage was relentless. But it wasn't about the IQ test anymore. It was about Kennedy's courage, his character, and the quiet power he had displayed when faced with ridicule and doubt. The test results. Once the focus of every conversation had barely mattered, the real story was Kennedy's ability to stand tall in the face of a challenge that was more about ego than intellect. And as the world continued to watch, the true value of his lesson began to sink in. His calm, unwavering demeanor had exposed a truth many had overlooked. Intelligence isn't something you're born with. It's something you build, brick by brick, through your experiences and actions. But as the days passed, Kennedy knew that his message hadn't fully reached Jill. She had been forced to confront her own assumptions, but she hadn't yet seen the depth of what he was trying to convey. He knew the media would soon move on to the next headline, the next story, and the next scandal. What mattered now was that the message he delivered didn't get lost in the noise. So Kennedy reached out to Jill. The phone rang late in the afternoon. Kennedy had just finished his second round of interviews for the day, his mind still turning over the events of the past week. He expected the call, but not in this way. Jill's voice came over the line, steady but cautious. "Senator Kennedy," she said, "I've been thinking about everything that happened." Kennedy smiled to himself. "I'm sure you have." "I was wrong," Jill said quietly, her tone changing from defensive to reflective. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought it was just a challenge, a way to expose a flaw. But what you showed, what you taught me, was far more than I expected. You didn't just pass a test. You showed everyone what it means to be strong in the face of doubt." Kennedy was silent for a moment. He had expected this conversation to happen, but hearing it now in Jill's voice gave him a sense of closure. He wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He simply felt the weight of the situation settle into his chest. "I didn't take your challenge to prove a point to anyone, Jill," he replied. "I took it because I wanted to show something bigger. Intelligence isn't a measure of your IQ. It's about how you live your life, and how you keep fighting when everyone else doubts you." Jill's voice softened. "I can see that now, and I think the world needed to hear it." Kennedy leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. The sun was setting over the Capitol building. For the first time in days, he felt at peace. The challenge had been more than just a political stunt or a media spectacle. It had been a lesson in resilience, in courage, and in the importance of staying true to oneself. "I'm glad we could have this conversation, Jill," Kennedy said, his voice warm but firm. "But I want you to understand something. It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been underestimated, who's ever been told they weren't good enough. There's a lesson in this for all of us." Jill was silent for a moment. "I hear you, and I'll make sure I remember this lesson." Kennedy nodded. "We all have our roles to play. My role is to keep fighting for what's right, to stand up for those who need a voice. But your role, Jill, is to use the platform you have to spread this message, to teach people that intelligence isn't just about tests. It's about heart and courage." The conversation ended with a mutual understanding. Jill had learned her lesson, but more importantly, Kennedy had sealed his legacy as someone who stood for something greater than himself. The world wasn't just watching him for his political moves. They were watching him for his strength of character, for the way he had turned an attempt to undermine him into a movement of empowerment. The public's reaction. The following weeks saw an explosion of support for Kennedy. People who had once viewed him as just another politician now saw him as a man of depth, a figure who understood the human condition far beyond the podium or the Senate floor. His social media following skyrocketed, as did the amount of people who felt empowered by his words. Jill Biden, for her part, quietly backed off. She never made the mistake of challenging Kennedy publicly again, but behind the scenes, she worked to foster the same message of resilience and integrity that Kennedy had shown. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Kennedy's final message had been received loud and clear. As he stepped off the stage that day, he had not only proven his point, but had opened a door for others to walk through. A door that led to a life where true intelligence was not just a measure of IQ, but of character and heart. As for Kennedy, he walked forward into his next chapter, knowing that his work was just beginning. The public might have thought the test was the end of the story, but for him, it was just another stepping stone on the path toward something greater. Weeks passed, but the memory of the IQ test challenge lingered in the minds of many. The media had moved on as it always does, but something deeper had been planted in the hearts of the public. Kennedy had not only weathered the storm of Jill Biden's challenge, he had transformed it into something far greater. He had turned a test of intellect into a test of character, and in doing so, had redefined what it meant to be truly intelligent. As Kennedy walked through the halls of the Capitol building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. His political career had never been about winning battles on the floor. It had always been about standing up for those whose voices were drowned out by the noise of the world. But now, he had become a symbol for something bigger. He had shown that integrity and resilience were just as important as intelligence when it came to leadership. Kennedy's inbox was flooded with messages of support from around the country. People who had once viewed him as just another politician now saw him as a leader with substance. Parents wrote to him, saying how his example had taught their children to stand up for themselves when they were ridiculed. Teachers praised him for showing their students that intelligence wasn't just about acing tests. It was about facing adversity with grace and learning from experience. Even Jill Biden, who had once thought her challenge would expose Kennedy's weaknesses, had privately admitted that the test had shown her more about herself than she had ever expected. She had learned that challenging someone based on their intellect wasn't about proving they were right or wrong. It was about understanding what truly makes a person valuable. In an unexpected turn, Jill reached out to Kennedy privately, asking to meet in person. Kennedy, never one to hold grudges, agreed. They met at a quiet cafe far from the press and the cameras. As they sat across from each other, Jill looked at Kennedy with a mix of respect and humility. "Senator," she began, "I owe you an apology. I thought I was challenging your mind, but I was wrong. What you showed me, and the world, is that intelligence is about far more than numbers. It's about character, integrity, and how you handle the hard moments in life. I've learned that the hard way." Kennedy nodded, his expression calm. "It's not about being perfect, Jill. We all have our flaws. But what matters is that we keep going. We learn, we grow, and we help others do the same." Jill smiled, a genuine smile this time. "I think I understand now. The world doesn't need more people who are just book smart. It needs people who can inspire, who can lead with heart. You did that." Kennedy took a moment, letting her words sink in. He didn't need to hear praise from her or anyone else. What mattered was that his message had been heard. That was all he had ever wanted. As they parted ways, Jill walked away with a new understanding of what leadership really was. Kennedy, on the other hand, knew that his work wasn't over. The challenge had been a stepping stone, just one more piece of the puzzle. But now, more than ever, he was determined to live out the lesson he had taught the world. True intelligence comes from your heart, your actions, and your willingness to keep learning, even when the world doubts you. That evening, as Kennedy stood on the balcony of his office, looking out over the city, he thought about Miss Clara, the woman who had seen something in him when no one else did. The woman who had taught him that intelligence was more than just what you could remember. It was about what you could give back to the world. Her words echoed in his mind once more. Music helps you speak your heart. It wasn't just about the test. It was about living with heart and proving that real wisdom is built on character and courage, not test scores. And with that thought, Kennedy knew he had won. Not the IQ test, not the challenge, but the battle for his own integrity. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., Kennedy knew one thing for certain. No matter what anyone said about him, he would never stop fighting for what was right. The test may have ended, but his journey of true intelligence, of courage, heart, and wisdom was just beginning. Conclusion and moral punch. The moral of the story was clear for all to see. Intelligence isn't about how well you perform on paper. It's about the strength to rise above adversity, the character to stand up for what's right, and the courage to live true to who you are. Kennedy's challenge wasn't just a political spectacle. It was a powerful reminder that true strength comes from within,